I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We are very accustomed on this program to covering bad news about the climate and about the environment. There's a lot of it and keeps coming. But a new law passed recently in New York State represents a sign of hope. Both my next guests have covered both this law and the context for it over the last couple years. Aliya Uteuova is a visual reporter for environmental justice at The Guardian US. Dharna Noor, who's been on the program in her previous incarnations, is now fossil fuels and climate reporter for Guardian US. And the article that we're about to discuss, Aliya wrote it. It came out first week in May with the headline, "New York takes big step toward renewable energy in quote unquote historic climate win." First sentence reads, and then I'll turn it over to my guest. "New York State has passed legislation that will scale up the state's renewable energy production and signals a major step toward moving utilities out of private hands to become publicly owned." Both aspects of that sentence very interesting to me. So first of all, Aliya and Dharna, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And let's start with you, Aliya. Tell us about the law that was recently passed in New York State.
Yeah, so last Wednesday, New York State has passed what is deemed as one of the most transformational climate and green jobs bills in the nation. It's called Build Public Renewables Act. The activists have been campaigning for the past 4 years, and what it essentially allows the state to do is to scale up its renewable energy production by New York Public Authority, which is NYPA for short, is one of the nation's largest public power utilities, and this bill would allow NYPA to generate all of its electricity from renewables. And that is really crucial for New York City because under the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the state aims to generate 70% of its electricity from renewables by 2030. So the passage of BPRA will be a major step towards meeting that goal. So
so when you say the state of New York needs to have 70% renewable energy by 2030, is that the state itself, or is that for all power utilities serving customers in the state?
So Aliya here, there's two different pieces of legislation that I think are really crucial. And as Aliya mentioned, the legislation that passed recently builds on something called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And that requires the state to completely decarbonize its electric grid. Again, there's benchmarks, but it's supposed to reach 100% renewable energy by 2040. And then also on top of that, reduce emissions from all sectors by 85% within the following decade. So that would be, also things like manufacturing, transit, et cetera. The sort of incredible thing about this bill is that it essentially is forcing the state to meet its previously agreed to goals, right? It was years ago that at this point that that New York State enshrined this Community Leadership or Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, but it really didn't come up with a funding plan for it. And so, essentially for about, 3 or 4 years, climate activists were sort of saying, what was the point of us putting all this effort into passing this incredible and ambitious law if you all weren't actually going to have the follow through to work on it? And I think what's really beautiful about the BPRA is that it's really a chance for the public sector to take the lead here. So where the private sector was really falling behind, where the CLCPA showed that the private sector was falling behind, now there's a chance for the public sector to step in and say, okay, well, if the market isn't going to do it, then the state's got to do it. And so now we'll have to see what happens. But, there's a real opportunity here.
Well, we've seen in my impression anyway, is that an awful lot of climate treaties, climate declarations, climate laws are noble and they sound great and everybody's excited, but they have no teeth. And so these high-minded, declarations, there's a lot, they have a long way to go to become reality. So it sounds to me like there are two aspects of this. One is that it is stronger mandates, maybe. A second is a stronger role for the public sector, and maybe there's a third of funding. I don't know, but how right am I about those three things: mandates, the public sector role, and getting some funds to actually do this? Either one of you.
I would say that all of those are really important aspects. And the bill, Aliya, maybe you can talk a little bit about the funding structure. Something that you highlighted in your piece and that I also think is really important is that there's another aspect here, which is labor protection, right? If we're funding mechanisms, if we're making pledges that hinge on essentially destroying a currently existing labor force without any protections and without any sort of idea what happens to those who are laid off in that transition, then I think that there's a real question about whether or not we're really achieving energy justice. And so there was sort of a fight between advocates who were pushing for this bill and New York's Governor Kathy Hochul, who essentially proposed a version of this legislation that would have been stripped of a lot of the labor protections and had some other differences too. So maybe Aliya, you could talk a little bit about what that sort of aspect of it is like. But I think that that's another really important part of the legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So something that the activists fought, spearheaded by Public Power New York, was labor language, and they won that pretty historic labor language. One of the pioneering newest climate and labor job languages in the country to enter a bill. So one of the interesting things is that it invests majorly into retraining candidates in green renewable jobs who have lost employment in fossil fuel sector will be prioritized for these positions. And also beginning 2024, NYPA will be, the bill would authorize the release of $25 million each year towards worker training programs. And we also have to remember that this is a major win for union workers. It protects wages, ensures fair pay, and ensures that union workers or contractors are hired for these newly created renewable jobs.
Well, that's very interesting. And Aliya, you also mentioned, and you've mentioned again, NYPA, NYPA, the New York Power Authority, and what's the story behind that? When was that created? By whom? Mm-hmm. What does it do?
Yes, NYPA was actually created by then Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, governor of New York, and many deem it as a predecessor to his
New Deal.
Yes, New Deal. Right. And it was incepted with the idea to provide low-cost electricity across New York State. In the United States, you might not be familiar, but U.S. operates 2,000 public power utilities, meaning that the state can generate public power for places like the museums, the zoos, state houses, schools, public hospitals, and it's usually cheaper. And in fact, every state besides Hawaii has public power, and Nebraska is the only state in the nation entirely supplied by publicly owned utilities. So when we talk about public power, in the case of NYPA, more than 80% of its electricity comes from hydropower. And that is pretty substantial and crucial because, as we remember, in New York, a lot of customers 2 winters ago and even last winter were hit with winter utility bill spikes by companies like Con Edison or Hudson Valley. A couple of factors contributed to that. It was the war in Ukraine. It was the storm in Texas that disrupted fossil fuel production, and volatility of gas prices has been a big issue. So who took the brunt of it? It was the ratepayers. So when you have a utility that is public, municipal, and that is supplied 80% by hydropower, that really alleviates that stressor of not knowing what your next bill is going to cost you.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And you point out in your piece, Aliya, that NYPA provides low-cost electricity to more than 1,000 customers, local and state government buildings, electric cooperatives, businesses, nonprofits. It sells some of its power on the wholesale market where utilities can buy it. And this legislation, it sounds like this becomes, and either one of you can answer this, it almost sounds like this becomes like the public option they talked about in healthcare, that if the private sector can't provide affordable power to people, that it's positioning NYPA to become an alternative in the future using alternatives to fossil fuel. Am I overselling this bill, or is that accurate? Or
I would say that in some ways it's actually even more powerful than a public option because, as you mentioned, Richard, a really important part of climate policy, and I think especially, as we're seeing the fallout of some of the more ambitious climate policies that have been passed over the past 10 years, and as we're seeing their sort of failure to really achieve the sort of ambitious goals that they were set out to achieve, mandates are really, really important. So I mentioned earlier that, there was another version of this legislation proposed by Governor Kathy Hochul in New York that activists really said sort of gutted the bill. It really removed the teeth of the bill. And one of the reasons that activists were saying that is because it essentially said NYPA can build more renewable energy, but it doesn't have to. In this bill, like NYPA is not only sort of presented as a public option, it's actually mandated to decarbonize its own electricity and to be there as as the sole provider of energy for a number of different customers, for public customers. Aliya mentioned schools and zoos and state houses and things like this. I think another really interesting part of this bill is its ability to help the public housing sector in New York. I think that, that's a really interesting sort of convergence of maybe two different sort of public sectors working together.
right?
And so I think, the ability, obviously, of like a publicly owned utility to be directly governed instead of regulated in some way, and that lack of a profit motive, obviously, I think could really create some opportunities for affordable energy for New Yorkers.
Yeah, I think it's huge. And is there any? So you're saying that the bill will also provide power to residents of public housing. Is that it?
Yes, NYPA supplies New York City public housing with low-cost, affordable utilities.
So is there any provision in the bill to expand access to NYPA's low cost and soon to be, or relatively soon to be, fossil fuel free power to other like private customers in New York State?
Yes, in fact, under this new bill, New York Public Power Authority, NYPA, is going to establish a program allowing low and moderate income customers in disadvantaged communities to receive credits towards their utility bills for any renewable energy produced by NYPA, which is a pretty big win. Another win that was secured under this is the ensuring that as I mentioned earlier, 80% of NYPA's power, more than 80%, comes from hydropower. The rest comes from fossil fuels. and natural gas. So the bill would spearhead phasing out of these things that were started in New York City. Hello?
Yes,
Sorry.
we hear you. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, called peaker plants, which are these NYPA in 2001 built these plants that are run on natural gas that help ratepayers and help the city meet its peak energy demands. So think the hottest days of the summer when everybody's turning on their air conditioners. So these plants emit nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide, and they tend to be in disadvantaged areas. So the 6 plants in New York City are located in Queens and the Bronx borough of New York City, and then the Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan. So these neighborhoods have been consistently shown to have one of the highest asthma-related deaths in the country. These are majority people of color neighborhoods. So this will be a big step towards phasing these plants out, because they were never supposed to be a long-term solution. They were supposed to be a short-term solution, but this is actually going to ensure that they're going to be phased out by 2030.
Oh, that's good to know. That's important. And let's sort of like zoom back a little bit now in our discussion. And Dharna, your title is Fossil Fuels and Climate Reporter on fossil fuels. I guess that means you have the dead dinosaurs beat or something. But so how does this law fit in with the overall state of the politics of climate change, either in the U.S.? Aliya, your article talks a lot about other states having, some element of public utilities providing power that provides 10% of the power nationwide. You mentioned that every state but Hawaii has some form of the. But first in the United States, and maybe we'll even go to the world. But where does this law fit in terms of the climate debate and climate proposals on a state level across the United States?
I mean, this bill is really ambitious in a number of ways. The mere fact, for instance, of including like an actual plan to decarbonize plants and to take, especially as Aliya mentioned, peaker plants offline, is remarkable. It's not the only state legislation in the country that's passed that has actually addressed peaker plants, but it's pretty huge to even kind of address the fossil fuel plants that are only on, like Aliya mentioned, on the hottest days of the year or the coldest days of the year, which is also really important, frankly, for pollution reasons. As you mentioned, also, they're often like located in communities of color with high asthma rates, often lower income communities. And also peaker plants release tons of pollutants when they're turned on. So if they're being constantly turned on and turned off, that means that there's even more of a sort of emissions risk for the people who live near them. So addressing peaker plants is pretty huge. Again, I think the fact that there's labor protections in this law really sets it apart from many other sort of policies like it. The fact of mandating agreements with the unions is pretty incredible. And then also, I think that the law in many ways shows a sort of trend in progressive climate communities or left climate communities toward this interest in the public sector taking on energy. We talked briefly about FDR's New Deal, and as part of the efforts to bring affordable energy and like reliable energy to places like the Tennessee Valley with the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the biggest public power authority still in the United States. Others like Bonneville, and a number of other sort of publicly owned utilities. There was a real sort of effort to eliminate the need for profit from the grid, from the manufacturing of energy and the distribution of energy. And I think that right now, a lot of the climate community is kind of coming back to that idea and saying, what would happen if investor-owned utilities were not in charge? Why is it that private companies are being like tasked with leading one of the most important transitions of our lifetime? And so, where I was reporting until recently in Massachusetts, there's a movement there called Take Back the Grid that's really focused on kind of public ownership of the grid. There's similar movements happening in Maine and other parts of the country. And so in that way, I think that this bill is really a harbinger, I hope, honestly, a harbinger of those kinds of victories. And I think that, there's a real, as Aliya mentioned, there's a strong legacy of that sort of public power in the United States that is often forgotten. And I think that it's something that we should really be looking back to as we think about decarbonization.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said, and just a couple, things that occurred to me as you guys were speaking. One is in terms of the peaker plants, and in terms of New York's being in Harlem and Queens and Bronx and so on. I've looked at the statistics. Depending on the report you read, Black children die from asthma at a rate that's either 7 to 9 times that of white children, and their lungs are not organically different, right? So there's clearly external factors involved, and clearly this kind of environmental pollution and other kinds are a huge contributor to it, which makes that aspect of it so important, I think, as a model for others. And Dharna, I think you're exactly right about, and Aliya, you made this point too about FDR. The Tennessee Valley Authority, if you read the political history of the 30s and 40s, was politically transformative, for one thing. It made FDR enormously popular in the hollows and hills of Kentucky and West Virginia, and places that had never had power before. These are the people who brought power to us. No powerful political issue, I think, that people haven't recognized could go across the political spectrum, and I'm delighted to hear of initiatives underway in other states like this. Maybe we can keep zooming back a little bit from this and talk about national legislation. I imagine it could be a little tricky, I guess, because there is no such thing as a national power authority or power utility, but certainly the federal government could empower these utilities, or repeat something like what was done with the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the rural electrification program, also under FDR. So I guess the question would be, how does this compare to national either initiatives that have been passed in the Inflation Reduction Act, or things that have been proposed, or it seems to me to be considerably stronger, but you guys know better than I. So how does this fit in with what's being debated at the congressional level, let's say? Either one of you.
I guess I can start just by saying, obviously, America is a very big country. The United States is a very large country, and an extremely diverse one, not only in terms of who lives here, but also in terms of how people get their power. And so doing something like this, just like with the sort of way that the energy grid is structured in the United States, would be pretty difficult. The US doesn't even just have one big energy grid. It's got like a couple of them, and then basically one that's like just Texas, which is a whole different story. And there are lots of like scholars and activists who are really interested in this idea of tying the grid together and also making that grid publicly owned, but we are a long, long ways away from that. What I do think is a sort of notable difference, I guess, between this and something like the IRA, and frankly, I think there's an argument for the need for sort of both, is that sort of carrot versus stick approach, right? Do you incentivize the investor-owned utilities and, frankly, the public utilities too? Do you incentivize them to bring more renewable power online, to bring more carbon-free energy online by giving them tax breaks and things like this? Or do you create these kinds of mandates where you say you are not only empowered to bring more renewable energy plants online, but in fact, you now have to under the law? I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is largely kind of based on the incentive model, largely based on things like tax breaks and incentives, both for consumers and for, sort of bigger entities, whether it's corporations or for things like publicly owned utilities. And this state bill is kind of, a completely different approach to that. It really says, we're not just going to ask you to do something, we're going to mandate that you do it. And we are not only going to regulate, again, we're not just regulating the private sector, we're going to actively govern the public sector to sort of fill in, where action's been missing.
Yeah, I think that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to both of your points. It's good to have a federal distribution of renewable energy, of course, but we are already seeing and have been seeing states building up their own renewable energy portfolio. And in fact, when it comes to wind and solar, a surprising leader or a group of leaders are states with who are run by Republican governors.
Totally.
It is Iowa and Oklahoma for wind generation. They are the leaders. For the largest producers of solar power, it's obviously California, but also Florida and Texas, which has also invested heavily, several years ago, into building up their transmission lines that would, when ready, when time reaches, transmit that solar and wind energy. I mean, it took a lot of future thinking on the state's behalf, but they're there. And I think one of the biggest reasons why Texas was able to develop their wind and solar portfolio is because it is lend itself very lucrative to lease land for wind turbines. Only 2% of the land in Texas is regulated by the federal government. So they're really leaning into utilizing that wind and sun rich resource that they have.
So I guess these Republican governors didn't listen to Donald Trump, who said that wind turbines kill all your birds, right? But
why would they listen to anyone when there's money to be made on?
Right, that's true. But it is fascinating. It is very interesting, and it would that's one pointer to potential solutions in the future, I guess. And another would be, I still think that rather than give tax breaks to private corporations, I'd love to see the federal government also help all these states that already have public utilities build them up, right? And as non-profit public sector alternatives. And I'm wondering, maybe
Act actually does include. I'm so sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Go ahead. No, please do. Yeah.
So the IRA actually does include some provisions that will make that more possible than before. It's a very wonky history, but in brief summation, for a long time, publicly owned utilities and publicly owned kind of like power entities in the United States were not able to take advantage of the kinds of tax breaks that basically make it affordable to bring on things like wind and solar. The Inflation Reduction Act changes that, which is potentially a pretty huge deal. I don't know how much advantage the public sector is taking of that yet in various states, but seeing that it's a direct pay that it's called. So seeing how much that can make a difference will be very interesting too.
Thanks for that. And I guess in conclusion, we've had these climate treaties, we've had these pronouncements about targets for reducing warming trends and so on, and very disappointing progress, I would say. I've come away with the overall impression that no country is coming near to doing what they need to do to address the climate problem, and maybe I'm overly discouraged or negative, but I'm certainly happy when good things are done and good goals are set. But I guess maybe the way I'd phrase my last question is, if New York State were a country, would it be meeting global climate goals, and would that be enough? And and where would that put the U.S. in terms of those goals, and so on? I mean, do either of you have any thoughts about that?
It's interesting because we do ask that question as journalists to our sources, many of whom study this and who potentially feel exhausted and jaded at the reality that there is no way to bring us back to where we were. Temperatures are rising, sea level is rising, and there's no way to go back to where we were, but there is a way to make it less detrimental for us. And I think focusing on these steps that make it, they might seem small, but they are actually substantial steps. And they also, what's interesting with this New York bill is it takes into account those most vulnerable to these to the climate change, to environmental justice happening. You mentioned asthma rates in South Bronx. It is a compounding factor. It's a multitude of things that contributes to this reality. It's the proximity to highways that were built historically in these areas. It's the proximity to power plants that were built intentionally there in these less desirable neighborhoods. And what we're doing here is like seeing real time, the legislation that can be reproduced in states elsewhere. And that's still a major win.
Thanks for that. And before we go, Dharna, what about you? Am I just a downer? Am I, where do you think we are on all of this?
I mean, I guess I would echo Aliya's point that obviously this is a huge problem that has huge effects for many different kinds of people. Yeah. We're talking now about the energy grid. It is not the only thing that we will have to change in order to meet our climate goals. But even if we're just talking about the grid, I guess one thing that I'll note is, it's really fun, I think, to think about the need to deploy more renewable energy. It's a much more fun thing to think about the new energy of the future and how much more of it we're bringing online. And there's quite a lot, honestly, there's quite a lot of progress on that front in the US. It's not where we need it to be, but there really is a lot of deployment happening, as Aliya mentioned, even in some surprising places, like lots of red states are kind of leading the way. What this bill does, and where I think that we're going to see a lot more focus, or we really need to see a lot more focus in the future, is also bringing the dirty power offline. We can't just, you can't just assume that kind of bringing more power online, even if it's renewable power, is going to change the grid. You also at some point have to take the other stuff online, or you're just going to have more power in general, or more power competing with other kinds of power. And so tying those two sort of goals together, not just bringing the good stuff on, but also taking the polluting stuff offline, I think is where we really need a lot more focus. It's somewhere that the Biden administration, I think, is it's getting a lot of pressure to put more focus. We saw, for instance, the passage of the wildly polluting Willow project in the Arctic shortly after the passage of, this kind of really ambitious climate law, the IRA. And so thinking through how we're going to meet and this isn't just me saying this, right? Like, this is top scientists who say that if we're going to secure a livable future, we actually need to start taking power offline, or taking dirty power offline, taking polluting power offline. Like yesterday, years ago, we need to have started. And so finding ways to make that part of the puzzle exciting, and finding ways to tie that to real wins for workers, for people's energy bills, really making those kinds of wins enticing for ordinary people like this bill does, I think will be really important.
Well, thank you both for that. And I'll close on a positive note. I think that, I do think that economic injustice is a crisis. I think the climate is a crisis. And one of the things I love about this bill, and I appreciate both of you coming on to talk about it, is that if the climate emergency causes us to grow the public sector, and if the economic emergency causes us to grow the public sector with the understanding we need to address the climate, that kind of issue intersectionality could point the way to a better future. So I won't end on a down note. Thanks to you guys. And again, Aliya Uteuova, visual reporter, environmental justice for Guardian US, and Dharna Noor, fossil fuels and climate reporter for Guardian US. Thanks for your great reporting on this, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having us.
It was a pleasure. And we'll be right back. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.